He told her he would still have a bedroom and kitchen, and he did. Sort of. They were piled high with supplies, but he assured her he could make do. At least the sink, kitchen range, and refrigerator were where he could get to them. That and his bed. While they were moving his things, she couldn't help but notice the picture he kept on the nightstand next to the bed. It was a picture of the two of them, taken one snowy afternoon at the Flagstaff campus. They had built a snowman, and Tanner had handed the camera to a passerby to snap the picture. Tanner seemed a little embarrassed when he realized Catherine had seen the picture, but she liked the idea of him keeping a reminder of their good times. Catherine climbed out of bed and pulled on her robe. As she did, a dream she had awakened from lingered in her mind. She had dreamt of a ritual that had first started on a warm spring morning when she and Tanner were students together at NAU. Tanner had been walking her to class that morning, and they were just passing the science building when Catherine felt a sudden urge to remove her shoes and walk the rest of the way barefoot across the lawn. She remembered now how Tanner had laughed at the suggestions, but she chided him into doing it with her. What fools they had made of themselves, but they didn't care. A tradition was born, and they seldom used the sidewalks again. From that morning on, wherever they went on campus together, it was more often than not done barefoot over the lawn. Catherine reasoned it was seeing the picture of her and Tanner in his apartment that had triggered the dream. It was just something silly she hadn't thought of in years. Once showered and dressed, Catherine looked over her new apartment. She'd be needing several things before she could set up real housekeeping, but she needed to buy a car before she could go shopping. She knew Tanner had to report back to work this morning, but maybe tonight she could ask if he would take her around to a few lots looking for one. She couldn't afford anything new, but she did want something nice, maybe a Honda Accord. She heard a rap at the front door and wondered who it could be. She figured it was probably someone looking for Tanner, since the word likely hadn't gotten out that he had moved next door. She stepped to the door and opened it. "Tanner!" she gasped at seeing him. "I thought you went to work." He grinned. "I reported in by phone, and when I learned there was nothing hot pending, I asked for the day off. I was wondering, would you like to go for some breakfast?" This brought a memory of another breakfast 8 years ago, the one at Denny's. Was Tanner remembering too? "Breakfast sounds nice," she said. "Let me grab my purse." "I was thinking of Denny's," he said before she had time to step away from the door. "There's one just down the street." Catherine rolled her eyes but didn't let him see. "Denny's is perfect," she replied. When she returned with her purse, it was to see him wearing a devilish grin that was a dead giveaway he was on the same wavelength as her with this Denny's thing. "They have great hot cakes and eggs," he said. She shook her head. "You really do have a remarkable memory, Tanner." He raised an eyebrow in an attempt to look puzzled. "Memory? About what?" She stepped out and closed the door behind her. When they reached the restaurant, it was a replay of the previous day's lunch. Tanner did all the ordering himself, and just as she guessed, he set them up with a breakfast exactly the same as the one they had shared that early morning 8 years ago. "So, how'd you sleep last night?" Tanner asked as the server stepped away. "I slept great, probably better than you in that cramped room." No, that room's not cramped. You should see some of the places I have to sleep when I'm on the road. So, what would you like to do today? I have the whole day off and I'm at your disposal." "You're unbelievable, Tanner Nilsson. First you gave up your room, and now you're giving up your day. You're taking all the work out of my coming home." "Hey, what are old-time friends for? Besides, I have a method to my madness. Once Vincent learns you're home, I may never get another minute alone with you." The mention of Vincent's name caught Catherine's interest. Of all the men she'd ever known, Tanner, Vincent, and Ned were the only 3 she'd ever thought of in a romantic way. When she was in college with Tanner and Vincent, she had bounced back and forth between the two so often she sometimes felt like the pendulum on her dad's grandfather clock. In the end, it was Tanner who had won her heart, but she wasn't so sure she had ever really let either of them know that for sure. "What's going on with Vincent?" she asked. "Did he ever marry?" "Vincent? Married? Come on, Katie. What woman in her right mind would ever marry Vincent? Have you forgotten the way he used to hound you for your attention?" She hadn't forgotten, but she didn't think it would be wise to admit it. "So, what's Vincent doing now?" she asked instead. "Still working for his father, just like always. He wears 2 hats for the company. He's a vice president as well as his father's personal pilot. Flies the old man all over the world in one of a fleet of company jets. Flies him around in a chopper, too, when the occasion arises." Catherine knew that Vincent's father was both owner and CEO of Wagner Aerospace, and she had always suspected Vincent would remain with the company. "So what about Corey?" she asked. "Is he still around?" "You heard Corey talking the whole time you were riding in my car," Tanner laughed. "I what?" The disc jockey on the radio, the one who goes by the name R.L. Dennison. That's our boy Corey." "Corey's a disc jockey? I thought he wanted to become an actor." "He got hungry and had to find a way to feed himself until his big break came along. Corey's the only one of the old fivesome who's married. Got himself a great wife. Her name's Stephanie Weber. Or it was until she changed it to Stephanie Harper. They met during an audition at a Hollywood studio where both were trying out for parts in a Disney film. Neither of them got past the interview, but that didn't stop them from taking up with each other and eventually falling in love. They have 3 daughters, Shelby, Cassandra, and Brittany." "Corey's a daddy. How fun! Does he still eat like he used to?" "Nah, you'd never recognize him. Stephanie put him on a diet and got him signed up at a gym." "You're talking about the same Corey we went to college with?" "Hard to believe, but true," Tanner assured her. Catherine sighed. "Sounds like most of our old group ended up doing just fine, if only things had worked out half so well for Brandon and Troy." Catherine wondered if this might be a good time to press Tanner for more details on those two. There probably would never be an ideal time, but this might be as good as any. "I heard Brandon disappeared the same night as the big graduation party," she said. "Yeah, after I dropped you off that night, I drove home to my apartment in Flagstaff. When I walked in, my answering machine was blinking. I clicked it on to find a message from Brandon. He sounded excited and concerned all at the same time. He told me he'd stumbled onto something big and wanted me to call no matter how late I got in. I tried reaching him for over an hour. I grew more concerned by the minute, so I got back in my car and drove over to his place. It was locked, but I was too impatient to wait for morning, so I picked the lock to find the apartment ransacked. I wasted no time calling the cops. All this was going on while I lay awake in my bed, crying my eyes out over the way I had decided to tell you goodbye before leaving for Melbourne the next day. My timing couldn't have been worse." Tanner went on with his explanation. "The next morning we discovered Troy's apartment was under investigation, and Troy was nowhere to be found. Once the blood-stained handkerchief turned up, Troy was under immediate suspicion. 2 days later, they found Troy walking along Highway 89 completely out of his mind. There was enough marijuana in his blood to put a horse in Never Never Land." "Marijuana?" Catherine gasped. "Troy would never have used marijuana or any other illegal drug." "Tell me about it. It was all part of the frame." Troy's story was never considered by the prosecution, even though Vincent's story supports it completely. Vincent gave Troy a ride home after the party. The problem was, Vincent drove off before Troy went inside. "Someone was waiting for him?" Catherine surmised. "Yeah. They caught him from behind and knocked him out with chloroform. Troy woke up locked and shackled in a dark room. He never got a look at his assailants. They shoved food and water through a hole in the door. He was there 2 days and refused to eat or drink anything. When he couldn't stand it any longer, he drank the water." "That's how he was drugged, with the water?" "You know that, and I know that, but the prosecution refused to accept it. Their contention was Troy got high on his own and murdered Brandon in his drugged state. Troy had little trouble passing 3 separate lie detector tests, but even those went for nothing. The prosecuting lawyer was a lowlife named Rowan Kentwood. Kentwood saw the chance to get a crime off the books, and to him that took precedence over guilt or innocence. Lying meant nothing to the man. And as for Troy's appeals, Kentwood is the kind who would walk through fire rather than admit he might have made a mistake." Catherine felt ill just thinking about it. "Where is Troy now?" she asked. "In the Arizona State Prison at Florence. I try to visit him at least once a month. It's sad seeing him like that. But I have to hand it to the guy. He's overcome his bitterness. He still proclaims his innocence, but he hasn't let prison drag him down. He's actually earned himself a law degree in the years he's been there." "A law degree? That sounds like Troy. I'm so sorry things worked out the way they did for him. I know he's innocent." "I'll prove it someday, Katie." For some reason, last night's dream came back strongly to her mind, and Catherine felt impressed to relate it to Tanner. She shook it off. Telling him about the dream was an outlandish idea. All it would get her was laughed at. "You never did tell me what you'd like to do with the day," Tanner reminded her. "You might as well take advantage of my being free. Tomorrow I might be off to Italy or who knows where, all part of my job." "I really hate to—" Tanner held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that," he said. "Now, what was it you wanted to do?" "What's the problem?" Brandon pressed. "Why hasn't she mentioned the dream?" "She's a difficult one, Brandon, but I can reach her. I know I can. Just stand back and give me some operating room. This is going to take every ounce of skill I have." "What I really need is someone to help me find a car," Catherine said. "I can do that. What kind of car do you have in mind?" "I was thinking maybe a Honda Accord. I hear they're pretty good cars." "Yeah, they're good cars. I'm sure we can find you one." The server returned with their breakfast. Catherine picked up a slice of bacon and was about to take a bite when last night's dream came back stronger than ever. What was it about that dream that kept prompting her to mention it to Tanner? Then it hit her. It wasn't just that she wanted to mention the dream to him. She wanted to live the dream. "No," she said abruptly. "I don't want to look for a car. I want to make a run-up to Flagstaff. Is that an option on your list of things to do for Katie?" "Well, sure, why not?" "We could just look the place over, for old time's sake. What do you say?" "Sounds like a plan," Tanner agreed. "It's a beautiful day for a trip to the mountains." Mitzi smiled broadly. "There, you see what I can do when I really concentrate? You have them on their way to Flagstaff, I'll give you that, Mitzi. But can you get them out to the cabin where Tanner can find the evidence?" "Just you wait and see, Brandon Cheney. Just you wait and see." Chapter 7. Catherine was glad Tanner chose the scenic route along Highway 89A that wound its way through Oak Creek Canyon. It had to be one of the prettiest drives in the entire state of Arizona. What made it even better was the little Stingray convertible Tanner now drove. It was a perfect day for a top-down drive. Catherine had to admit Tanner had come a long way since the days of the old Dodge Neon he once owned. Not that the Dodge didn't hold a ton of wonderful memories. Between it and Vincent's Porsche, Catherine never wanted for a ride. It was a little immature, she acknowledged with a twinge of regret, the way she deliberately instigated competition between the two of them over whose car she would ride in. But she was young, and being showered with attention from two handsome men was flattering. She just couldn't help it. "So tell me about this car," she said. "Where'd you come across it?" "Okay, it's a completely restored '69 Corvette Stingray 3. It belonged to a drug dealer I helped bust a couple of years back. The car was impounded, and one of the lawyers at the firm where I worked helped me rescue it." "Cool. So what does Vincent drive now?" "You know Vince," Tanner laughed. "He thinks the more something costs, the better it is. He's driving a Lexus SC 430. Great car, but the top won't fold down." "And Vincent's not married?" "Nope. He almost got married once, but at the last minute he backed out. Nice lady. She went on to marry one of our local newscasters. They have 2 kids and appear to be happy campers. Vince still talks about her now and then. He's never been sure whether he made a mistake or not." Tanner glanced over at Catherine. "There's someone else he's never fully gotten over." "Meaning me?" Catherine asked. "Meaning you, Katie. Vincent's a good man. If you ever do think of marrying, you could do worse." Catherine didn't know whether she liked Tanner saying that or not. Not that she didn't think Vincent would make a great husband, and not that she didn't realize she could do worse, but the story Tanner had just told her about Vincent and the other unnamed lady made her realize there was also someone she herself had never completely gotten over, but it wasn't Vincent. She glanced up to see they were just coming to the Flagstaff city limit sign. "The last time I passed that sign, we were headed out of Flag toward my folks' old house in Mesa, remember?" "How could I ever forget? That was one black day in history for the old gang." Catherine hadn't meant to open wounds, but that's evidently exactly what her remark had done. Feeling a little guilty, she withdrew into her thoughts. It seemed like another lifetime since she had last been in Flagstaff. The place had grown some, but not all that much. She thought about mentioning a jaunt by the old campus, but didn't have to, as it soon became obvious that was exactly where Tanner was headed. "Believe it or not, this is my first trip back to Flag since I moved out a week after graduation," he said. This came as a bit of a surprise. Here was a man who traveled all over the world, and yet he hadn't made it far enough to revisit the land of his college days. "That really is a great car," Brandon mentioned to Mitzi. "If I'd had one like it when I was a mortal, maybe Catherine would have hit me up for a ride every now and then." "Yes, and maybe if you'd had a car like that, so many other girls would have been ringing your phone that there would never have been time to give Catherine a ride." Mitzi was slightly disgusted with herself for saying that. In the first place, she knew Brandon never really was in love with Catherine. The make-believe game of I Love Catherine was just that, a game he and his friends used to play. And even if he had been in love with her, why should it matter to Mitzi? It was none of her business. It was certainly stupid to allow herself the hint of jealousy she felt when she saw the way Brandon looked at Catherine. Crazy as it was, she did feel jealous. "If I'm going to entice these two to the cabin," she said, forcing her mind off the subject, "I should look the place over a little closer. All I've seen so far is what you showed me in the hologram. You want to see the cabin? You think that'll improve your chances for convincing them to go there? I know it will, and this is the perfect time, while Catherine and Tanner are looking over the old campus. Okay, take my hand. Since I know the way, I'll drive." Mitzi smiled at the way Brandon put it. Angels didn't have to drive. They could do their traveling by simply thinking themselves from one place to the next. Holding Brandon's hand wouldn't help anything, but it was a nice gesture all the same. She touched his hand, and they were instantly there. "Wow," Mitzi remarked. "They call this a cabin? I'd call it more of a mountain mansion. This place must be worth a couple million. Probably more. But that's just petty cash for Zachary Wagner. It sure is creepy seeing the old place again. A hologram is one thing, but actually being here—" "Does it bother you because this is where you died?" Mitzi asked. "I didn't actually die here," Brandon explained. "They shot me, but it was just a superficial wound. The place where I actually died is a long way from this cabin. But this is where it all started, and yes, it is a bit creepy seeing it again. I almost wish I didn't have to go inside. I hate to tell you this, but the success of our assignment depends on you going inside, Brandon. It won't be that bad." "I know, but you have to understand. I was one of those guys who was squeamish seeing my own blood when I cut a finger. Even as an angel, I don't like looking at blood. It's just me, what can I say?" Mitzi's curiosity was getting the better of her. "If you weren't killed here, where did it happen?" "It was just a place. I'll take you there sometime, but not today. Maybe after our assignment is in the finished file." "Sure, but we do need to see inside the cabin. You mentioned Zachary Wagner. I take it he still owns the place?" "Yeah, he uses it to entertain prospective clients. I understand he's upped the security a notch since my little antic, and he's much more careful how he uses the computer now." "Upped the security? That might make it difficult for Tanner and Katie to get inside." "Don't kid yourself, Mitzi. Tanner can handle whatever security Zachary Wagner has installed. You should know that if you've been tagging along with him the past 5 years. "You're right. I just wasn't thinking. So where exactly are these clues we're supposed to lead him to?" "In Wagner's office, where I broke into his computer 8 years ago. There are 2 clues. One I left on purpose. The other was anything but my doing." From the way Brandon said this, Mitzi thought she knew his meaning. "Your blood?" she guessed. "My blood. I told you I was shot." "That was 8 years ago, Brandon. Would there be any trace left by now?" "Oh yeah, blood is hard to hide from someone as skilled as Tanner, even 8-year-old blood. He'll use what's called a luminol test." Mitzi was familiar with the luminol test, and she knew Tanner kept a case in his Stingray with the necessary equipment for the test. "I'm ready to see that office now," she said. "Shall we go in?" Chapter 8. Catherine and Tanner stood on the edge of the campus lawn, gazing across at the buildings on the far side. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" she ventured. He smiled. "A barefoot walk across the grass? Come on, I'll race you to the other side." Even with Catherine's head start, Tanner had caught up by the middle of the lawn. He grasped her arm and brought them both to a stop. "Remember the first day we ever did this?" he asked. "How could I not? Those walks were great fun." Catherine almost told him about her dream right then, but didn't. "So, what do you want to do after we're finished looking over the campus?" Tanner asked. "We could rent a couple of horses and go for a ride in the woods." "Tanner," she laughed, "I've been living on a ranch in Melbourne for the past 8 years. Sorry, but I've had all the horses I can stand for a while." "Let me ask you something," Tanner said, changing the subject. "Do you believe in angels?" "What?" she asked. "Why would you ask that?" "I don't know. I've just been having some feelings lately. Like now, for instance. I've got a feeling Brandon's nearby." Catherine paused for a moment. "You know, now that you bring it up, I feel the same way, too." "This is crazy. Brandon can't be here." "Well, why can't he?" Catherine asked. "You asked if I believe in angels. Well, I do. And I believe Brandon is an angel now. He could be here with us if he wanted to. I not only think he's here, I think he's trying to tell us something. What if Brandon, as an angel, wanted the 2 of us to team up and work on solving his murder? What if he even had something to do with us meeting at the airport the way we did?" Tanner eyed her skeptically. "I'm a man who deals with factual evidence, not the whisperings of an apparition. But I do somehow feel like Brandon is here, and that he's trying to tell me something about his murder. So do I, Catherine said. Do you know what gave me the idea for coming to Flagstaff? It was a dream, and I think maybe Brandon had something to do with my having the dream. Tanner turned silent and remained that way for several seconds. When at last he spoke, it was with a suggestion that caught Catherine's complete attention. I want to drive up to Zachary Wagner's cabin, Katie. I don't know why, but I think Brandon wants us to look the place over. Well then, we'd better be off. It worked, Brandon shouted. You whispered to them and they heard. Mitzi felt herself suddenly swept into Brandon's arms, where she was crushed into a hug. You're terrific, Brandon yelled. How would I ever have done this without you? Do we make a great team or what? We do make a good team, don't we? She agreed. I'll scope out the cabin, Tanner proposed, after I get you checked into a room where you can wait for me. You'll do no such thing. I'm not about to be shoved aside. Be reasonable, Katie. This is what I do. You'll be safe in a hotel room. Let's get one thing straight. I will not wait in a room. I'm going with you. Tanner stood in deep thought. I want your promise you'll do exactly what I say, just as long as what you say has nothing to do with keeping me out of the action. He sighed. Agreed. Let's get started. Chapter 9. Tanner had been driving north on Highway 89 for about half an hour after leaving Flagstaff when the turnoff to Zachary Wagner's multi-million-dollar cabin came into view. The cabin was situated several hundred feet off the road, completely surrounded by a majestic stand of ponderosa pines. Tanner pulled off the highway and came to a stop at the entrance to the private road. Without a word of explanation, he got out and spent several minutes looking things over. When he got back in the car, he turned to her. Do you still keep a journal, Katie? Every day, without fail. Tanner shoved his foot down and the car lunged forward. Pray tonight's entry won't be all that exciting. The road ended at the cabin. The place doesn't look much different, he observed, shutting off the engine. Catherine agreed. Tanner stepped out. I want to have a look around to see what we're up against. I'm not sure what kind of security to expect. Hopefully a mountain cabin won't be high enough on Wagner's priority list to use anything too sophisticated. Tanner reached in the back seat and removed a black leather case. Cop stuff, he told her, evidently reading the unasked question in her eyes. You stay in the car. I'll be right back. Catherine reasoned they should have a search warrant, but if Wagner did have something to hide inside the cabin, a search warrant wouldn't be that hard to block. Legal or not, this was the way they had to do it. From somewhere in the overhead branches, a pine cone fell, bouncing noisily off the hood of the Stingray. That's it, she exclaimed, grabbing her purse and the car keys. I think Tanner needs my help a little closer than here. Jumping from the car, she hurried around the house where she spotted Tanner at an electrical panel. What are you doing? Tanner snapped. I told you to stay in the car. I must not have heard you right. I thought you said don't leave the keys in the car. I didn't. Here they are. She handed him the keys. Tanner shook his head, then pulled a set of latex gloves from the black leather bag. Put these on, he said, and from here on out do exactly as I say. Tanner went back to checking the electrical panel. The security in this place has holes big enough to drive a truck through, he said. I'd have more trouble getting into Mom's old cookie jar than here. What's with the electrical box? Catherine asked. This top part is the panel feeding electrical power to the whole cabin. The smaller part at the bottom is the controls for the security system, such as it is. As Catherine looked on, Tanner applied a set of jumpers to some terminals inside the box. This system works on heat sensors, he explained. The cabin will be laced with sensors in every room. If any one sensor detects body heat, a little transmitter in this box sends a signal to a remote location where security is being constantly monitored. What I've done here will defeat the transmitter. The sensors will still know we're inside, but they can't tell anyone. They rounded the cabin to the front door, where Tanner picked the lock. They pushed the door open for a look. Not much had changed on the inside either. Now we try to retrace Brandon's steps from the last time we saw him the night of the party, Tanner said. Catherine thought a moment. The last I saw of Brandon, he was standing next to the punch bowl. You and I were with him, and so was Corey. Brandon showed us his watch. Then we headed for the dance floor. That must have been just 20 minutes or so before we left the party. Yeah, and when we did leave, Brandon was nowhere in sight. I remember something, Catherine suddenly blurted out. I glanced at the stairs and saw Brandon going up them. I remember thinking he shouldn't be doing that." "You saw Brandon climbing the stairs?" Tanner asked. "Yes, I'm certain of it. But why would he ignore Vincent's warning about going up there?" "That's a good question," Tanner remarked. "Maybe the answer lies somewhere upstairs now. Let's have a look." "Have you ever seen the upstairs?" Catherine asked. "No. Vince was always protective of that part of the cabin." "Well, I have. Once when Vincent and I were on an afternoon drive, he got a call from his father. It was about a phone number Zachary had scribbled on a pad in his office. He needed the number right away, so he asked Vincent to get it for him." "You were in Zachary's office?" "I was, and I know exactly where it is." "Was there a computer there?" Catherine knew Brandon was a computer nut. If anything could have tempted him to go upstairs, it would have been a computer. "Yes," she half shouted, "there was a computer." "Show me the room," Tanner said. Catherine started up the stairs with Tanner right behind. "There," she said, reaching the top of the stairs. "Down the hall, last room on the right." It was almost frightening the way Tanner had the lock picked as fast as most people could use a key. The inside of the room had changed some since she had last seen it, but not much. The computer was obviously a newer model, but it was on the same desk where the old one had been. She reached for the light switch. "No," Tanner said, grabbing her hand. "I disarmed the primary alarm, but there could be a secondary alarm tied to things like light switches. I'll raise the blinds to give us some light." After raising the blinds, Tanner's next stop was the computer. "I'm betting this is where Brandon disappeared to," he remarked. Even if Zachary had his computer password protected, Brandon could have been in it faster than it would take him to spell his name backward. "Are you thinking he might have discovered something on the computer to put his life in danger?" "Yep. And that makes Zachary a prime suspect in my book. I've always had a bad feeling about the man, but I've kept it to myself for Vincent's sake. Vince thinks the sun rises and sets on his father. He'd never believe the man could do any wrong. It almost makes me wonder if—" "You're not hinting you suspect Vincent of any wrongdoing?" Catherine gasped. "You don't know how much I want to believe otherwise." Tanner removed a spray bottle and a battery-operated light from his bag. "Let's take a look and see what a luminol test might uncover." Catherine was confused. "Shouldn't you start by checking the computer?" "Two reasons for not doing that. First, it's not the same computer. And second, I'm guessing this computer is connected to a network. If I were to power it up, chances are it could alert someone at another station." "How am I doing?" Mitzi asked excitedly. "Fantastic," Brandon assured her. "Next, you have to get Tanner over to that wall with the luminol spray. That's where he'll find my—you know. I hid a computer disk there, too. One with enough information to hang Zachary Wagner out to dry. Look, right there in the crack between those two logs. See it?" "Yes, I do see it. Now all you have to do is get Tanner to notice it." Mitzi studied the situation carefully. Tanner was right in front of the computer, about 3 feet from where he needed to be. She still wasn't sure Brandon's blood would show up after all these years, but why should she doubt? If the computer disk had remained hidden all that time, maybe Brandon was right about some celestial help being involved. "All right, Mr. Nilsson," she said. "I know you don't believe in me, but that's never stopped you from listening to my suggestions. I want you to concentrate on that wall to your left. There's something hidden there you need to find. Part of it you can find with that luminol spray. Now get to it." Tanner sprayed off a few shots of the luminol around the computer. The blue light showed nothing here. He sprayed again, inching his way throughout this entire section of the room. "Here," he suddenly said, pointing to a faint glow. "My hunch was right." Catherine moved in for a closer look. "Can you get a good enough sample for a DNA test?" she asked. "Oh, yeah. With the equipment I have in my lab, I can." Tanner glanced up, smiling faintly at her. "This could come as a shock, Katie, but I have DNA samples filed away for my friends, including Brandon. You never know when my samples might come in handy. Like now, for instance." "You keep DNA samples?" she gasped. "On me, too?" "Yeah, along with your fingerprints and a sample of your hair. I take my occupation seriously." "You have samples on me? How did you—" "Hey, it was a snap. Hair from your comb when you didn't notice, prints from some movie tickets, and DNA from—" "From where?" she demanded. "Well, if you remember, you did kiss me on more than one occasion." "Lipstick? You got my DNA from my lipstick? How could you?" Tanner set to work gathering samples of the blood. He was just finishing when something else caught his eye on the wall next to him. "What have we here?" he asked, digging the computer disk out from between the logs. This was obviously hidden here on purpose. I'm guessing by the same person who fell here after being shot. You think if Brandon did find something, he might have copied it to a disk before being confronted by Zachary's men? That's exactly what I'm thinking, Katie. If someone shot Brandon, and he fell next to the wall, he may well have hidden the disk without being seen. It was crammed in there far enough that I barely noticed, even with my face right next to it. Catherine suddenly noticed a beeping sound coming from Tanner's pocket. "What's that?" she asked. "That's a signal we have trouble. We're about to have company, Katie. When I got out of the car at the private road, I set up a motion detector just in case. Well, guess what? Someone just set it off. We have to move fast. You go to the car and get it started. I'll grab my jumpers off the security panel to cover our tracks, then join you." Taking the keys from him, she ran for the car. She started it, then moved over to the passenger seat. Tanner showed up just seconds later. The car was in motion even before his door slammed closed. "Are we going to try and outrun them?" Catherine asked. "No, I know another way out. If we're lucky, we'll be out of sight before they arrive. Hang on, you're in for a rough ride." Catherine held her breath as the Stingray headed straight for a stand of ponderosa pines in the opposite direction of the road that brought them there. "Are you sure about this?" she gulped. "I'm sure. We did it in Vince's Porsche once." Catherine said a silent prayer as the Stingray jostled over places a car was never meant to go. At last, they burst out of the trees and sped onto the flat surface of Highway 89. Tanner headed for Flagstaff with the pedal to the floor. "What about your motion detector?" Catherine called out. "Leave it. I'm not sure what we've stumbled onto here, Katie, but you can bet I want to get it to my lab to check it out." Catherine suddenly realized that her relaxing day at Flagstaff was over. It had taken a sinister turn into the unexpected. Were they really onto something that might reveal Brandon's true fate? All she could do was hope. Chapter 10. Conrad Donahue eased the dark green Cadillac to a stop directly in front of Zachary Wagner's cabin. He slowly scanned the area for anything out of the ordinary. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but a gut feeling told him otherwise. He headed straight for the security panel, where he examined everything. There was no evidence of tampering, but he knew the diagnostic test would tell the real story. Conrad removed a small electronic device from his blazer pocket and punched in the code while watching a series of lights visually track the system's status. The system seemed to be working perfectly now, but the same test performed remotely less than half an hour earlier had indicated a problem. Conrad next entered the cabin, where everything still looked good. Cautiously, he climbed the stairs and stepped up to Zachary's office, where he listened for any sound. Complete silence. The door was locked just the way he'd left it when he was here 2 hours earlier. Opening the door, he spotted the window blinds which had been opened. He had checked those blinds not 2 hours ago. Someone had been in this room since that time. Conrad was furious. The security people had swept down the entire cabin not 5 hours before and had declared it clean at that time. Now it would have to be swept down again, and there wasn't much time since the cabin was scheduled for a business conference in the early evening hours. This would be a maximum security level meeting since it included several high-ranking military officers. Conrad could kick himself for not staying at the cabin after the sweep down, since he and Franco were planning to remain at the cabin throughout the time of the meeting, which probably wouldn't break up until the early hours of the morning. They had decided it wouldn't hurt to slip away to a local club for drinks and a hand or two of poker. They had ample time to get back before any of the guests would arrive, several hours, in fact. Wagner wouldn't be happy when he learned of a security breach while Conrad and Franco were away playing. Everything had seemed fine until Conrad decided to run a remote test on the cabin's security system. That's when he'd discovered the problem. The test had indicated a systems transmitting device failure. He grabbed Franco and came right to the cabin, leaving Franco at the entrance to the private road. He wanted him in position to get a look at anyone exiting the premises. Conrad's cell phone sounded. "Yeah, what do we have?" Conrad asked. "Plenty on this end," Franco shot back. "I found a motion detector. Someone was expecting you at the cabin." "We did have visitors then. There's no sign of them now, and I didn't see them on the road. They must have found another way out." "Straight through the woods," Franco confirmed. "I got a fix on them when they hit the highway. They were in a red sports car. There was a guy driving and a woman passenger. I got photos of the occupants and the license plate." "Good work, Franco. I want to do some more looking around here. Give Zachary a call and let him know what we found. He'll want to run a trace on that license plate, and he'll want to contact our people to run another check on the cabin." Shoving the phone back into his pocket, Conrad went over the office inch by inch, turning up nothing more than an unusual chemical smell which he couldn't identify. Next, he checked outside, finding tire tracks leading into the woods. That's how they got away, all right, he reasoned, but we've got 'em. Chapter 11. Vincent was just buttoning things up at the hangar after a round-trip flight to Denver in one of the company jets. He had flown there to pick up a couple of military brass and return them here to Phoenix to discuss a multi-million-dollar contract with Wagner Aerospace. These men were scheduled to ride up to the Flagstaff cabin with Zachary in his limousine later in the day. At the cabin, they'd meet with a group of engineers from the firm to cover a few details of the program in question. Zachary's chauffeur met the men when Vincent landed not 20 minutes ago. They were checking into a hotel now. Vincent headed for the door with the intention of driving straight home. He hadn't gotten 3 steps when his cell phone rang. It was Corey Harper. "Yeah, Corey, what's up?" Vincent responded. "I'll tell you what's up," Corey instantly shot back. "Our boy Tanner is pulling a fast one, that's what's up. Would you believe Catherine's back in town?" "Katie?" Vincent excitedly responded. "She flew in day before yesterday. Tanner met her at the airport and is busy keeping her all to himself. One of the guys here at the station spotted them near the escalator. I just learned about it an hour ago when he showed up for work after his 2 days off. Wait till you hear the rest of it. I put out the word over the airwaves for my listeners to watch for a bright red vintage 1969 Corvette Stingray 3 with a man and a blonde woman inside. I told them it was a contest. Anyone spotting the car and giving me an exact location got their name in a drawing for tickets to the upcoming George Strait concert. My lines have been ringing off the hook. Tanner and Catherine are headed south on Interstate 17, about 30 miles this side of Flag, even as we speak." "He took her to Flag. Why would he take her up there?" "Don't know, Vince, but they're on their way home now, it would seem. I used my expertise finding them, so now it's your turn. I can't get involved, naturally, being a married man and all, but I doubt you're of a mind to let this pass." "You got that right, Corey. Thanks for the heads up. I owe you a big one. Can you keep me posted as to their exact location?" "I can do better than that. I just talked to a friend of mine from the sheriff's office. He's off duty and owes me a big favor. Listen up, Vince, while I tell you what I have working." Vincent listened to Corey's plan. "I'm proud of you, man," he told Corey. "That's a classic. This is going to be fun." Vincent shut off his phone. "So Katie's here in Arizona," he mused, "and Tanner thinks he has her all to himself. The man's in for a surprise." Tanner decided on the short route, I-17 back toward Phoenix. This would save time. They were barely out of Flagstaff when Corey's voice came over the radio. "This is R.L. Dennison speaking, and have I got a deal cooking for you. How do tickets to George Strait sound? I have 2 of them here I'm just dying to give away. We've got a little game going, people. In case you haven't heard, we have a mystery car hidden somewhere within the sound of my voice, and it's up to you to find our car and pinpoint its location. That's all you have to do to get your name in a drawing for 2 George Strait tickets. The mystery car could be anywhere. It may be parked. It may be roaming a city street. Or it could even be on a jam-packed freeway. But this car won't be hard to spot. I think you'll agree when you learn what it is." "Uh-oh," Tanner moaned, as the first hint of what Corey was up to crossed his mind. "I think we're about to become instant celebrities, Katie." Corey continued, "What you're looking for is a candy apple red 1969 Corvette Stingray 3, possibly with a man and a blonde woman inside. Keep an eye out and let me know what you see. That's all it takes to have your name in a drawing for 2 George Strait tickets, and you heard it from the one and only R.L. Dennison." "That's us," Catherine laughed. "What's that nut up to?" "That nut has learned you're home, Katie. We now have listeners all over the state just dying to tell him where to find us, and you can bet Vince won't be far behind them." "Vincent, you think?" "I know. There's no way we can make it home with those 2 bent on finding us. With Corey's friends in every walk of life and Vince's ingenuity to back him up, there's no stopping those guys, and you can bet whatever they come up with will be dramatic." For the next hour, Tanner constantly checked his rearview mirror as well as the cars in the opposite lane. They were just approaching the final rest stop before reaching Phoenix when Tanner uttered an abrupt, "Uh-oh, I think it's showtime, Katie." Catherine looked to see an unmarked patrol car behind them. The red lights were flashing. "The guy wants me to pull off at the rest stop," Tanner said. "This has Corey Harper written all over it. I have little choice but to pull over. If you see a chopper closing in as soon as I'm stopped, you can bet Vincent is the pilot. They couldn't have picked a worse time for their little game. I need to get to my lab." Tanner pulled off with the patrol car right behind, and Catherine really did hear the sound of an approaching helicopter. Tanner was right. "Why would those guys do this?" she asked. "Vincent figures I've had my chance alone with you. Now it's his turn. I'm sorry to leave you in his clutches, Katie, but he's harmless. I figure it'll go something like this. I'll be handcuffed and given my rights. The charges could be anything. That's when Vince will swoop in from the sky to carry you off on the wings of his daddy's chopper. Under different circumstances, I'd find a way to foil his plot, but that could tie up my whole evening, and I need to get to that lab. You'll be all right. He'll probably take you out for a great evening, then bring you home late. Knock on my door when you get in. I'll still be up running tests." "But what if the officer takes you to jail or something?" "Leave that to me, Katie. Just go with the flow and show Vincent a fantastic time. He deserves it for what it'll cost him later." The officer approached on Tanner's side of the car. "Please step out of the car." Tanner winked at Catherine, then turned back to the officer. "What's the problem? I know I wasn't speeding." "Out of the car," the officer commanded. "I can do that, officer, but first I want to hear the charge. What did Corey and Vince tell you to use as an excuse for this bust?" Catherine noticed the officer trying to hide a surprised reaction. "You're wanted on an outstanding warrant for driving on an expired license," he said. Tanner laughed. "That's the best those guys could come up with. I should at least rate armed robbery." Before the officer could respond, Tanner opened his door, stepped out, and assumed a spread-eagle position against his car. For a moment the officer remained frozen, but then stepped in and applied the cuffs. Moving to the patrol car, he opened the back door for Tanner, who got inside. The officer headed back in Catherine's direction just as the chopper set down not 20 feet away. "Are you Catherine Dalton?" he asked. "Yes, I'm Catherine. I'm sorry you had to be put through this, ma'am, but there's a friend of yours here to pick you up." "Vincent Wagner?" she guessed, causing the officer another start. "Mr. Wagner says you know him. He offered to pick you up so you don't have to go down to the jail with Mr. Nelson." Catherine grabbed her purse and stepped from the car. The officer escorted her to the chopper. On the way, she glanced at Tanner to see him holding up a pair of open handcuffs and a wallet. He winked at her, and she couldn't help but laugh. Tanner had picked the officer's pocket, and the man didn't even know it yet. "Katie!" Vincent shouted over the noise of the chopper. "Get in!" She did, and with the officer's help, he closed her door and she snapped the seatbelt. "Katie, Katie, Katie," Vincent said, moving the controls to lift the chopper off. "What are you doing in Arizona?" "I've come home," she smiled. "So where are you planning to take me?" Vincent laughed. "Tanner filled you in on my intentions, I take it." "Generally. Where are you taking me? I'm not exactly dressed for an evening out in this blouse and dockers." "You'd look good in a gunny sack, Katie." "We're going to the Boulders Resort at Carefree." "No, not the Boulders, not with me looking like this." The officer's mouth dropped as he spotted Tanner leaning against the outside of the car. "What the?" he gasped. "How did you—" "The how doesn't matter," Tanner explained. "What does matter is we get this little mistake of yours swept under the rug before it gets carried away." Tanner handed the astounded officer's cuffs and wallet back to him. "I see you work for the sheriff's department, Officer Blake? I assume you're off duty, right?" The officer shook his head. "You're good, Nilsson," he said. "I've heard stories, but I never believed them till now. You know, Corey will make life unbearable for you if you ever mention this to a living soul. Your secret's safe with me on one condition, Officer Blake. I have a pending emergency, and I need to get to my apartment at 59th Avenue and Thunderbird the fastest way possible. A sheriff's escort would be real nice, and it would get you off the hook when revenge time rolls around." The officer laughed. "Sorry, pal, no can do. Like you say, I'm off duty. I've had all the pranks I can handle for one day. See you around." He got in his car and reached for the ignition key, then stopped, drew a breath, and looked back at Tanner. "My keys?" he asked. "An escort home?" Tanner countered. "I'll even throw in your service revolver," he said, handing the officer back his own gun. "You are good, Tanner. Give me the keys." Tanner made it home in just under 20 minutes. Chapter 13. There was no talking Vincent out of the Boulders. Catherine wouldn't feel comfortable at this haven for the rich and famous under the best of circumstances, but dressed like this— It was just after 5 when the chopper touched down on a section of lawn that doubled as a landing pad. Vincent secured the craft, and the two of them started for the dining room in a personalized shuttle. "I've already taken the privilege of ordering," Vincent explained as they approached their table. "The prime rib here is out of this world." It was obvious that Vincent hadn't changed. He was still the same take-charge-of-everything guy Catherine had known and loved throughout their college years. "So, fill me in," Vincent prompted, even before settling in his chair. What's been going on since you ran off to the land down under? I'm not telling you one thing until you assure me Tanner won't be spending the night in jail. He even had that figured out, eh? Vincent laughed. Jail wouldn't hurt him. Tanner should know better than to keep you to himself. How come you told him you were coming home and not me? I didn't tell anyone I was coming home, she replied. Tanner and I met at the airport completely by accident. Can you believe the luck of that guy? Are you really home for good, or will you be returning to Australia? My folks live in Australia, Vincent. Naturally, I plan to visit them now and then, but as for me ever living there again, I don't think so. Even though Catherine was worried about Tanner, she knew pleading his case with Vincent would only fall on deaf ears. Unless, of course, she told Vincent the reason Tanner needed to get home to his lab. Tanner hadn't said anything about her not telling him, but since Vincent's father was so heavily involved, she reasoned otherwise. What were you and Tanner doing in Flag? Vincent asked. We went there on a whim, she explained. We toured the old campus, then took a run by your father's cabin. You were at my father's cabin? Why? Catherine could kick herself for opening this door. Why had she mentioned the cabin? It had slipped out without her even thinking. Just for old time's sake, she responded. I'm surprised you got past security. My father has a high-security conference with a bunch of military brass scheduled at the cabin this evening, and he sent 2 of our most capable men up to secure the place. Catherine kept her answer simple. We weren't there very long, Vincent. Even if your men noticed, they didn't confront us. To Catherine's relief, he didn't pursue the issue further. She figured he'd be in touch with his men about it. She hoped Tanner had covered their tracks well enough, but she wasn't sure. Even though she didn't want to share all she knew with Vincent just yet, she did want to hear what he thought about Brandon's murder. Not that she suspected Vincent could be involved in any way, but still, the evidence was found in his father's cabin. Let's talk about Brandon, she proposed. I've only heard bits and pieces of what happened that night. Vincent exhaled. None of us really know much about that night, he explained. We're all certain Troy had nothing to do with it, but, Vincent swallowed, I consider not being able to help Troy the greatest failure of my life. I exhausted every resource in my power, but whoever framed him did it so well, they didn't leave one trace of evidence behind. It's been 8 years, Katie. I'm not saying I'm ready to give up, but I am saying the chances of Troy ever being a free man again are rapidly fading. Vincent's remark about no evidence put Catherine in a tempting position, but she had already decided not to disclose anything just yet. Her next question was more risky. What about your father's cabin, Vincent? Was it ever checked for signs of foul play? Vincent thought a long time before answering. You're walking on thin ice, Katie, he finally said. Thanks to my holding a graduation party at the cabin the same night Brandon disappeared, my father was faced with the monumental task of protecting the name of Wagner Aerospace. He hired a crew of investigators to go over every inch of the cabin and oversaw the investigation personally. A detailed public report was issued. Whatever happened to Brandon didn't happen at my father's cabin. Catherine realized she had struck a nerve, but she couldn't just back away now. Were there other investigators at the cabin besides the ones your father hired? You have no idea how much pressure came from the press. They all wanted inside the cabin with their television cameras. Fortunately, my father was able to legally block their efforts. He had hired the best, and they pronounced the place clean. What the press wanted was nothing more than journalistic sensationalism. Catherine couldn't be sure whether Vincent was trying to protect his father's name, or if he was, heaven forbid, a part of whatever happened in that cabin that night. When did Brandon leave the party, and who was he with? She pressed. Brandon was supposed to ride home with me, but he slipped out without a word and caught a taxi. I didn't actually see him do it, but 2 of my father's men did, Conrad Donahue and Franco Naylor. The waiter stepped up with soft drinks and breadsticks. Catherine retreated to her own thoughts and felt a chill at the prospect that Vincent might be involved in Brandon's fate. By now, she was positive Zachary played a major part in it. She had to give Vincent the benefit of doubt. He was probably taking up for his father out of love and respect. I think this has gone far enough, Katie, Vincent told her, and you can put your mind at ease about Tanner. He's not in jail. Corey couldn't talk the officer into that part. Tanner should be on his way home, safe, secure, and pretty darn lonesome. Tanner pulled into his apartment lot as the patrol car drove away. Thanks for the escort, Tanner said under his breath. It was loads of fun. All the way to his apartment, thoughts of Catherine had filled his mind. Much as he disliked having his time with her cut off so abruptly, he had to admit she deserved to spend some time with Vincent. He'd like to be able to think of himself as the real reason she came home, but that was pure foolishness. Whatever chance he had with Catherine vanished 8 years ago on the front porch of her parents' home. Stepping through the door, he flipped on the light. There was work to do, and he wasted no time getting started. Moving to his computer, he turned it on. 3 major challenges faced him: matching any fingerprints on the computer disk to Brandon, matching the blood samples to Brandon, and learning what information was recorded on the disk. He started with the disk, where he discovered 2 distinguishable prints, a thumb and forefinger. It was simple to retrieve a sample of Brandon's prints from his archives, and even simpler to bring up comparable images on his computer screen. "Bingo," he cried. "We have a match. You did find something on Wagner's computer, didn't you, old friend?" "Yes, that's exactly what I did," came an excited but unheard voice from one of 2 angels looking over Tanner's shoulder. "Just keep on trucking, old friend. You're on the road leading straight to my killer." Tanner felt a chill that made him stop and glance around the room to be sure he was alone. Crazy as it sounded, he could almost swear he had heard Brandon's voice encouraging him on in his efforts. Shrugging it off, he moved on to his next item of priority, matching the blood samples. Chapter 14. "We could be on a roll," Brandon sighed. "Tanner is so close to finding what he needs to bring my case to a close and get Troy out of that stinking prison. But I'm afraid I've gone and blown it, Mitzi." "What are you talking about?" she asked. Brandon gazed at her smiling face, where he noticed something he hadn't before. It was her eyes. They were the softest, bluest, most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. How could he have missed noticing them before? He found himself unable to look away, and even more startling was what he was feeling inside. He suddenly wanted this assignment to slow down, perhaps take just a bit longer than it looked like it would. Not that he didn't want things set straight for Troy's sake, but prospects of ending his time with Mitzi so soon were suddenly painful. There was something about her, even more than those fantastic eyes that Brandon liked, and even the word liked didn't seem to be strong enough. Maybe it was her skill at communicating with people like Catherine and Tanner. She did it with such a soft voice, never raised much above a whisper. Or maybe it was her bubbly personality and constant upbeat attitude that made it almost impossible to keep from smiling in her presence. He didn't know. At the moment, he felt so good he didn't even care about the whys. He would have felt better still if it weren't for one aggravating problem staring him in the face, a problem of his own doing. "My computer disk is password protected," he told her. "So what's the problem?" Mitzi asked. "Tell me your password and I'll find a way to get Tanner to think of it." Brandon rubbed his chin. "That's just it, Mitzi. I can't remember the password. I was under some pretty heavy stress when I copied that disk. Tanner's good at what he does, but the intricacies of computer science is another field altogether. I'm the one who could break through passwords, not Tanner. Without that password, he'll never find what I copied on that disk." "You forgot the password," Mitzi laughed. "You, of all people, shouldn't see that as a problem. All you need to do is open a hologram of yourself putting it in the computer. How hard can that be?" Brandon felt suddenly very foolish. "A hologram?" he muttered. "Why didn't I think of that?" He just overlooked the obvious, that's all. It could happen to anyone. Following dinner, Vincent arranged for a chopper ride to get a bird's-eye view of Flagstaff at night. Though he never mentioned it, Catherine assumed he was trying to outdo Tanner's taking her there in his Stingray. Vincent even made one pass over his father's cabin, where the cars and lighted windows gave evidence to the meeting taking place there. The experience wasn't enough to make Catherine forget her concerns over Tanner, nor her fears about Vincent, but it was a breathtaking ride, one she wished didn't have to end so soon. They were almost back to the airport where the chopper was kept hangared when Vincent asked a question that she knew he would before the evening ended. "So, where are you staying, Katie?" This brought a smile, as she knew the reaction she'd get once he was told. "I'm staying in Tanner's apartment." She had to bite her lip to keep a straight face when she saw the look in his eyes. "Tanner moved out," she laughed, when she could stand it no longer. "He's bunking down in his lab for the time being." "That will never do," Vincent stated abruptly. "You're not even going there tonight. I'll get on the phone and have my secretary find you something more suitable immediately." "Don't bother, Vincent. I like my present accommodations just fine." "I'm not taking no for an answer," Vincent insisted. "You're a lady in need of a night on a white horse, and I'm available." "And a very handsome night you make indeed," she observed. But I really prefer finding my own apartment, Vincent. End of discussion. Darn you, Katie Dalton, Vincent grumbled, still playing hard to get. When are you ever going to give up and admit I'm the best thing that could happen to you? I'm flattered, Vincent, believe me, but choosing between you and Tanner is just too hard a decision right now. Mud bath? Mitzi asked in shock. Where did you come up with a password like mud bath? Brandon closed down the hologram he had used to retrieve the forgotten password. I remember it now, he sheepishly explained. When I went looking for a password, I had mud bath on my mind. Vincent had spilled punch on my shirt, remember? Well, what I had in mind for him had something to do with the muddy pond in front of my apartment. He was supposed to take me home that night. I think you can figure out the rest on your own. You were facing death and all you could think of was getting back at Vincent? That beats anything I've ever heard. I wasn't facing death when I came up with the password, Mitzi. I was about to rejoin the others at the party. It was later, when I went back to the office a second time to make the call to Tanner, that my killers showed up. Well, this does present a bit of a problem, Mitzi observed. When Tanner gets to the point of looking for the password, he'll be thinking of words you might have come up with. But mud bath? That's going to be a tough one to reach him with. Why couldn't you have used something like Catherine? That would have been obvious. Chapter 15. It was close to midnight by the time Tanner matched the blood samples taken from the cabin to Brandon's. Now he had a string of irrefutable evidence showing Brandon had sustained a disabling wound inside Zachary Wagner's office, probably from a gunshot. The full story of what happened to Brandon was far from complete, but this was a major breakthrough. The next item on the agenda was the information contained on the computer disk. Tanner was positive it was Brandon stumbling onto that information that got him killed, and he was just as positive that revealing the contents of the disk now would shed some powerful light on the dark secrets surrounding Brandon's demise. Slipping the disk into his computer and punching in a few commands quickly revealed what he had assumed all along. Brandon had safeguarded the disk with a password. Okay, Tanner told himself, we need a password. What would Brandon have used? When Tanner typed in the word Catherine, it brought an instant smile to Mitzi's face. She didn't have to say one word to Brandon. The way he refused to look at her was proof enough he knew exactly what she was thinking. So much for the obvious, Tanner said when the file refused to open. What could Brandon have used? There was a party going on downstairs. I wonder... He typed in one word after another with this thought in mind. Music, dancing, band, graduation, cap and gown. Nothing worked. Next he tried his own name, followed by Vincent, Troy, and Corey. Another dead end. Use your head, Tanner groaned in disgust. What would Brandon have been thinking about? Mud bath, Mitzi whispered in his ear. Type in the word mud bath. Blast you, Tanner Nelson, Tanner chided himself. This is no time to let nonsense words fill your mind. Think serious. It was pathetic. Tanner couldn't shake the one stupid word that kept repeating itself over and over in his mind. Pushing back his chair, he stood, walked to the refrigerator, and poured himself a cold drink of milk. He downed it, then closed the door to his office, and remained staring at his computer for several seconds. Still, that ridiculous word plagued him. There seemed only one way to get rid of it. Moving back to his keyboard, he typed in the letters one at a time. Eyes widening, he watched the screen light up, revealing an unlocked document. This is ridiculous, he told himself. Brandon's ghost can't be here talking with me. But how else could I have come up with a password like mud bath? That's not even a real word. The document, Brandon shouted. Read the document. Never mind how you got the password. He's not listening to me, Mitzi. You tell him to read the darn thing. Mitzi smiled and leaned in close to Tanner's ear. Read the document, she whispered. It's what Brandon wants. Setting thoughts of ghosts aside, Tanner focused in on the document. He hadn't read a page when a wave of nausea washed over him. No wonder Brandon was so desperate for help in dealing with this. Tanner shot to his feet and slammed an open palm against his chair hard enough to send it tumbling to the floor. If I'd only stayed at that party another 10 minutes, I'd have been there when he needed me, Tanner agonized. Leaning down, he continued reading until he had finished the entire document. There's enough evidence here to put you away for the rest of your natural life, Zachary Wagner, he said, the words rolling angrily over curled lips. Even if I can't get you for Brandon's murder, I've got you for the very reason he was murdered. Tanner rubbed a hand nervously across his mouth as he considered what else this evidence might indicate. Could Vincent possibly be part of it? The thought made him ill. It would almost be worse than losing Brandon to the hideous crime in the first place. Vincent had to be innocent. Anything else was unthinkable. But even if he was innocent, there was no way to protect him from the fallout disclosing this information was destined to bring. Zachary Wagner was his father. How would Vincent react to Tanner, his own friend, using what he had in his hand to bring Zachary down? The sound of someone trying to pry the door suddenly pulled Tanner's attention away from the computer. Instantly, his instincts kicked in. It could be nothing, or it could be Zachary Wagner's men there to finish the job they started the night of Brandon's murder. Tanner moved quickly, knowing exactly what had to be done before the lock on the door could be defeated. Never was he more glad for his high-speed computer, as well as his trained ear, which had little trouble detecting the sound of a lock-pick rolling over the tumblers. He knew he had only seconds remaining. Punching in one final command, he yanked the disk out of the computer and dropped it between the back of the table and the wall. He grabbed the power cord for the computer and ripped it out of the receptacle, causing the screen to immediately go dark. The door then burst open, revealing a man in a black suit sporting a very large handgun with a silencer on the barrel. Tanner dove for cover behind the edge of the table just as a muffled pop from the man's gun sounded. A stinging sensation in his arm told Tanner he was hit, but not with a bullet. He glanced to see a tranquilizer dart buried deep in his skin. Not good. He realized he had very little time before slipping into unconsciousness, so he had to act fast, and he had to act smart. The sound of footsteps told him the man was closing in. Pulling the dart from his arm, he waited until the assailant was just at the edge of the table, then springing to his feet, he planted a hard fist against the man's unsuspecting face, driving him backwards, where he tripped over the fallen chair. Tanner rushed forward, jamming the dart into the back of the man's neck. He realized the amount of tranquilizer left wouldn't put the fellow out, but he hoped it might be enough to slow him down a bit. Tanner's mind was already numbing. Escape wasn't an option at this point, but there were others. Bursting through the door into the part of the lab he now used as a bedroom, he slammed it closed behind him and snapped the lock. Hurriedly, he moved to the closet and grabbed a pair of shoes and a leather belt. Fighting to remain alert, he replaced the shoes and belt for the ones he had been wearing. He quickly shoved the old ones under the bed and out of sight. The last thing he heard before succumbing to total blackness was the bedroom door being kicked open. It was a furious Conrad Donahue who moved to Tanner's limp body and gave it a kick to ensure he was out. "I owe you big time," Conrad spat out, trying to shake the cobwebs from his head. "No one turns my own weapon on me and gets away with it." It had taken only a short time for Wagner to run a check on the license plate for the sports car Franco had spotted and to confirm its owner as Tanner Nilsson. Conrad and Franco were released of their security roles at the cabin and given the job of dealing with Tanner. By late afternoon, Conrad knew more about Tanner Nilsson than he assumed Tanner knew about himself. This was thanks mainly to the avenues available to Wagner Aerospace, avenues not open to just anyone.
This concludes CD number 2. To continue listening, insert CD number 3.